Commanders, thanks for joining us today on our newest podcast. Today we'll be talking about the combat update that hit the galaxies a few weeks ago. Joining us today on this podcast, we'll have three of the integral designers that worked on this update. We have with us DesignerKeenser, DesignerDunsel, and DesignerData. I don't think there's a lot of introductions needed for DesignerKeenser since you've seen him quite a bit and he's been on with me on a few of the podcasts and videos. But how are you, DesignerKeenser?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Looking forward to chatting with our fans today again and seeing their reaction of how things go.
Awesome, thanks a lot. And DesignerDunsel, I think you might have seen him lurking around on Reddit and on Discord and a few of our Q&As, but how are you today, DesignerDunsel? And if you can give us a small introduction as well.
I'm doing well, Panic, thanks. I'm DesignerDunsel, and I'm a systems designer on the LA side for Scopely. I've been involved in mission rewards, revamps, ship design in some cases, and also helping out with the combat rebalance.
Awesome, thank you. And last but not least, we have with us DesignerData. Again, DesignerData is definitely lurking always on Discord, but if you can just give us a small introduction about yourself and how are you as well?
Hey Panic, good to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm lead designer on the project, one of the lead designers on the project, and my role is merely to support the team, to help every designer to be able to perform at their best, and then help a lot with the cross-communication across all of the different departments.
Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today. And let's hit it off with the combat update. An update which really changed a lot on the ships, the bases, and the officers themselves. So, just as a general question, what kind of work has gone into making this update itself?
Quite a lot, actually. First of all, whenever we approach an update that big, we don't just jump into it. We've been watching for quite a while. We've been playing ourselves. We're first gathering the information. We're looking at how are we playing ourselves, what problems are we seeing ourselves. Everyone on the team is playing the game. Then we're looking at internal playtests, at the feedback, both through our customer support, but then also direct community channels. And then, of course, we also have access to a broad range of data through our analytics team, which is great. Based on that, we then, as a team, decide on what we need to action. What are the builds that we see problems with? What are the builds that are overperforming? What are the builds that are underperforming? And then based on that, we start setting out goals for an update like that. And those goals, we then start to address with assumptions, design changes. Those design changes we can then prove through our Excel models. We have quite elaborate Excel tables. All of our designers are very strong when it comes to Excel and VBA that allow us to simulate a change to the game on a very, very fast iteration basis. So we enter these changes into our tables. We run millions of simulations, millions of combat simulations, and we see what it introduces to the game. Every single change does also affect a lot of other values. Now, this update alone had thousands of different data entry changes, but each of those also affected a lot of other permutations. So before we're pushing live, we want to have a clear understanding of what we're actually pushing and what we're actually affecting. After our Excel simulations, because of that, we go into internal playtests. We use our QA team a lot, which has great support for the team. And then, based on what we're seeing inside those tests, we come back to the drawing board. It can very well be that things that we thought would be working didn't work at all, and we need to adapt, readjust, and start from scratch. So an update like that goes through a lot of iterations until it is finally able to go live. This is the reason why we don't want to rush this. We want to make this right.
Yeah, adding on to that, there's a lot of new capabilities we had to develop to get this out in the scale and the balance that we actually delivered upon. You know, when you make a game, I only joined as the game launched. There were lots of people that were working very hard on it before bringing it to launch. But when you design a game, you don't know all the things that are going to take place exactly when it gets live. And seeing players doing what they did in combat and all the different abilities and combinations that were introduced and players were utilizing, you really start to begin to understand your game better, and you're able to act on it and design around the new situations much more effectively. And for us to get to that place, like Data was referencing, having to improve our simulations, our Excel simulations, and also our game simulations, improving our understanding of how to go about balancing the combat was just very time consuming. And there were a lot of steps and a lot of checks to make sure that it all went smoothly and all went right, to make sure that no number was reduced when we pushed the balance out, and just very carefully going over everything with a fine-tooth comb to deliver a great product.
I can definitely as well attest to that, at least from my personal experience with the update, and of course looking at a lot of the player sentiment coming in through the update. It was definitely a seamless experience when being launched with no issues. And of course, I don't know, this is my personal view, but seeing the numbers of my existing ships go up was a thoroughly enjoyable experience. So yeah, thanks for that. Just jumping on to the next question. So why did the actual update go? Why were the choices specifically made for the update? Like with the rebalance of the ships and the officers and
like just buffing everything is fairly easy. That is easy to do, but doesn't achieve anything for us or for the players. So what is rather important to us is what of our assumptions are working and what isn't working. What is similar to what Dunsel already said here, this game is too big. Like we have an amazing team. I'm proud of every designer that is working, everyone really working on this team. But this game is far too big to be able to design everything in a vacuum. We are depending on our live environment. We're depending on the feedback that we're gaining from our players, and we need to look at that feedback. We need to look at the way players are engaging with it in order to see the actual, to identify some of the problems really. So based on that, we can then see some of the builds that we've been designing overperforming or underperforming. In order to make an interesting game, what you don't want is that there's certain builds that are just straight up better than everything else. And when we're approaching an update like that, we're looking exactly at those builds that are underperforming, and we're looking at those builds that are really overpowered in the comparison. And we're trying to even that out. We're trying to create a more interesting choice for our players.
One of the major goals that we had in the rebalance was to extend the length of combat across the board. There were certain builds and ships that were very centralizing the combat meta, if you would, because they relied on lots of upfront damage and damage in a very short amount of time. And that really, to Data's point, decreased viability and interesting choices across the board because there were fewer officers. There were just fewer officers that were able to provide enough value in that short of a combat. One of the choices that we made was for officer stats and the way that they affect ships now, the 300% bonus versus the 100% bonus. Increasing the ratio of health to damage across the board lets combat last a lot longer. And it also has the benefit of letting officers be more influential on ship stats. So it was kind of really two benefits with one fix that we were really happy when we discovered and jumped upon.
So everyone within the team goes through a lot of hoops to get these changes out, because it's not only about listening to player sentiment, but it's also, you know, understanding the actual numbers and seeing what effects they have to the gameplay and whatnot. So from a more fun perspective, what was the biggest challenge that you faced when executing this update?
Complexity and permutations, really, amount of permutations. And I was mentioning the Excel simulations that we're doing beforehand. Those simulations allow us to generate a lot of data very quickly, which is great. I'm doing one change for one ship. I can easily simulate on tens of thousands of battles on how the ship now performs against all of the competitors and all of the marauders, or rather hostiles. This is great, but at the same time, we then need very easy means of understanding this load of data very easily. And for that, we're creating overview tables that color code the kind of changes and show us the change introduced actually to the game. So it's about the ability to introduce change very quickly, the ability to then simulate that change towards the game, and then to understand the impact of it. On a very fast basis, we are able to iterate and adapt and try out. Like a lot of the things, a lot of the assumptions that we have in the beginning turn out not to be true. And what you're then doing is you throw it away, you start from scratch, come up with something new. But the speed at which you are able to do that basically, or ultimately, this defines the quality, really.
And I assume as well that it's not only about looking at the actual current graphs, and it's also, as you were talking about before, it's looking about live data and live updates so that you can pivot whenever required, because it's not about a set structure on what it will be changed and what is going to be changed.
That's true. So what we can't simulate in our tables, and this is where we have to be really careful, is the meta of a game. If you have the typical rock, paper, scissors, and to an extent, the game is a very complex set of rock, paper, scissors. Every strategy game really is. The meta decides a lot what is effective. If everyone keeps running around with rocks, yeah, well, then just improving the combat performance of scissors doesn't really help you. Right? It just changes that after the update, everyone is just turning to the scissors instead. So understanding the meta is absolutely vital in order to understand the kind of changes that you are introducing to this complex system like this. And in order to understand the meta, we can't rely on the internal simulations, and we can't even rely on our internal playtests. We have to rely on our own live accounts. We have to rely on the conversations that we have with players, and we have to rely on the communication that we see within the players' community. This is absolutely vital in order to understand the complexity of a combat update like this.
Yeah, I also want to hit home how vital player feedback and community feedback and people's opinions and input on what they're experiencing in combat, what kind of builds they've been using, what they've been going up against that was really frustrating to them. We super relied on reports of that nature to point us in the right directions of investigation and what things we should be looking at and what things we should be balancing towards. And just wanted to thank everyone that ever submitted any kind of feedback and appreciate them.
We're seeing now that bases have gone up in power immensely. Like, was this intended? And if so, how come?
Expected. I would say expected. The power inside the game is just an accumulation of stats. So there's a direct relationship between the amount of stats that I have on an entity, like a ship, or even a hostile or a station, and the power generated by it. Now, the calculation, the formula behind it is the same in every instance. So the hostile generates strength exactly the same way as the station does, and the same way as the player ship does. However, the power is, the stats are very different. Stats are profiles where it makes sense to have an enemy or a player ship or a defense platform, for example, to have a different profile so that it can better serve the role it is in. And what we did see is that the formula that was once created for strength does not work well anymore with the new stat profile that the player station now has. Now, player station strength beforehand was inflated already. So this didn't really change. It was just beforehand, the player station was just not really cutting it on its own. Any player station would always rely on the ships on defense. And one of the major things that we addressed with the station update, with the update to our defense platforms, is really the amount of damage that can be taken and the amount of damage that can be dealt by the station itself when there's no ships at home. Beforehand, a naked station with only the defense platforms at home was an easy target. It would directly, as we say, roll over and wouldn't really fight back. And considering the amount of time that players invest in upgrading those defense platforms, it didn't seem like a good dynamic that we wanted to further encourage. So we wanted to make sure that the investment in those defense platforms is actually valuable and makes sense. And we also wanted to make sure that it makes sense to also take ships outside. If every time you're taking ships outside, you're basically facing an open station, being attacked by everyone, that's a pretty bad dynamic, considering that you don't really want to take your ships outside. So we want to encourage you to use your ships. We want to encourage you to go out, explore the world, use the ships either with or against players. That's up to you. The station now does allow exactly that. And yes, similar to what players already have noticed to the higher end hostiles, stations are now not a direct equivalent to ships anymore. Now, players will find out what the relationship is, and we might find a better formula at one point that is better able to reflect this. But for now, what the strength formula does reflect is the amount of stats that is gathered on one entity, and it does it one-to-one on every entity.
So, yeah, I just wanted to go to a kind of a different question. So I know a lot, this specific update also tackled a lot of the underperforming ships that we had within the game, specifically that of the Mayflower, or I think, as I've seen, one of the best names I've seen is the May Not Flower. But on its specific level, the D3 and the Legionary were not updated as much as any of the other faction ships were. What's the reasoning behind that?
Because they were performing already pretty well. This goes back to what we've been discussing a bit earlier. You're looking at the ships that struggle, and if you, at the same time, while you're updating the ships that struggle, if you at the same time then also update all of the other ships, then kind of your update to the ships that you wanted to do becomes kind of moot. So in order to have that update have an impact, you focus on the ships that need that update, or that can do better. Like when we're updating the Legionary, for example, which does pretty well on its own already, and also fills a very interesting role in a PvE economy, then we kind of go back to the Mayflower and say, now we have to update the Mayflower again, and we kind of get into like an endless loop where we just keep increasing ship stats. That is possible. Some players would be happy about it, but it doesn't make for a good game or a balanced, interesting game.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense, and the nature of a balancing as well is that exactly you're trying to balance everything in the game, and not everything will, I guess, receive the same kind of love as other counterparts. So I think also this is talking from my personal experience as well, but I would love to see more PvP events within the game. And I know PvP events is something that is both a hot and cold within the community as well. Some players really love it, other players don't. We have a few of them going on, but with this update, are we going to be seeing more of those events and more types of PvP events?
PvP events is a really interesting topic. Before this game went live, and especially in beta, our beta players know about that. We had quite a lot and very aggressive PvP events running, and people were generally happy with that. But that's more because at that point we had a very hardcore community ourselves. We also play like very hardcore. So this is great. But since the game launched and since the community has increased and the player types have increased, we have been looking a lot at the types of PvP events. And as you're mentioning it, not everyone is happy with a pure direct PvP event. So one of the questions that we kept coming to was, how can we make PvP possible without enforcing it on every single player across the game?
Yeah, and also within the community itself, I know we've had a lot of the members of the community wanting kind of newer events and newer kind of refresh events, but we can definitely promise that from next year, a lot of these different types of events will be coming in. There's a lot of testing involved now and a lot of trial and error with events, but yeah, can definitely promise newer and fresher events coming along. With this update, we I know as DesignerDunsel also mentioned, we also buffed a lot of the officers, or at least 300% for the officers from the 100%. A question kind of that was lingering within the community was, there are a few officers out there that are still working as intended, and if there was an upcoming fix for these soon?
Officers, the same way as we just addressed the ships, is an even bigger amount of work than the ships even were. Those officers exist, like every of these officers exist across basically all of the player progression. Yes, it's sometimes easier or harder to get depending on where you are inside the player progression, but for the ships, we kind of know what level the player is when he has them. For an officer, we basically need to do every single permutation out there. So any update and improvements to officers is vastly more complex than an update to ships. Now, same as for the ships, we are always gathering information. We are always looking at what we need to improve. This doesn't stop. Like this is certainly not the last update, and the game will be continuously improved on all of these fronts. But like an update to officers on a scale like we did to the ships is something that is even more complex than what we just did to the ships.
Yeah, and obviously the opt-in, I guess, was for the actual ships and the PvP and the PvE centric of the game, and obviously I can understand that these officers will be fixed at some point soon. So yeah, one of the questions again that was asked by the community was that a lot of people are used to common and uncommon, rare and epic ships representing some form of power. Yet the Botany Bay, the Devore were untouched, while the USS Franklin, at least at the lower levels, dropped in performance. Why were these ships not vastly increased in combat and defensive power in comparison with all the other ships?
Yeah, with this combat balance, we specifically were looking to help the faction ships that needed balancing. The Franklin and even the early 20s ships like the Kumari and the Kehra were not actually really the focus of this combat balance. We did help those ships through G2 and G3 with the officer stat bonus, not the Franklin obviously, but we will always be looking at their performance in the future and keeping an eye on who needs help next in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, and kind of piggybacking off that, there's a lot of content out there from the content creators and a lot of theory crafting from the players around, you know, one of the biggest thing is don't build the Kehra and wait until you have the Kumari kind of thing, because the Kumari just outperforms it. Why is that? Was there a reasoning behind this, and why weren't these balances as well?
I would say that certainly depends on your play behavior. I built the Kehra and I used it for a very long time. I didn't use the Vahklas myself, I skipped it. But I always knew I wanted to go Romlan, and that meant battleships. So I needed a ship that is really good at grinding battleships for the parts, and I used my Kehra for that. I used it for quite a long time. I would say it depends a lot on your overall strategy, and it depends a lot on the way you're progressing through the game. How much time do you want to invest into certain ships, and do you want to jump certain ships? Now, jumping certain ships is a decision like a lot of other decisions inside the game, and it's a valid decision. Like, I wouldn't want to build a game where every ship is 100% necessary for players, because we take the choice away from our player. So if a player decides that because they want to go Federation, they don't want to use the Vahklas at all and directly go for the next best explorer, that's a perfectly valid choice. But then there's also a player that wants to go Klinger, and then having a decent explorer for a while does make sense.
Thanks, Data, for that. Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. And kind of wrapping up, that was kind of the last question I had from the community, at least the ones I got. Sorry, guys, if I missed any of your questions. Is there anything you guys would like to add before we close this podcast?
Just want to reiterate to what we mentioned earlier, what Dunsel also was saying. This game wouldn't be anything without the community. Games like this live based on the community. This is both on the player-owned narrative, like all of the different stories that we're hearing coming out of the alliances and the politics on those servers, which is super interesting. And which is my pet peeve of why I'm so interested in this game. But also in order to come to an understanding of the actual impact of our changes. There's only so much that we can do with the limited team that we have. There's no team on any studio worldwide that is able to perfectly balance a game like that within the studio. This always relies on the intelligence, the hive mind of players. So, yeah, big thank you to all of you for the constant feedback, for making the game what it is today, as we're celebrating our 1 year anniversary. And I'm absolutely looking forward to further push player-owned narrative for this game, to give more tools and more options to our players to own and craft their own narrative within the universe of the show that we all love so much.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you as well to all the players and feedback and opinions that were voiced and insights that we've been given on Discord and elsewhere. And we are happy that the combat balance has been at least seemingly well received by the community. But we're not going to be resting on our laurels, and we're going to be constantly looking at the state of the game, the state of new officers that are emergent, and keeping tabs on that and always looking to improve.
Thank you all for listening, and keep giving us your feedback. It's a large section of what our play experiences combined with data, and then the feedback from our players that led us to do this combat rebalance, and make it a priority for delivering this content to players. As always, we always want to do things faster and sooner, but as we've made clear here a few times, that this was something that we wanted also to take slowly and do right, and continue to improve on in the future, whether that's just smaller tweaks that we would have going forward or future content. We hope it's all something that our players can enjoy and love.
And thanks everyone for listening to this podcast. Obviously, if you have any questions, please just hit us down in the comments. come join me on Discord, pester me on Discord, or our beloved moderators. Yes, Phil, I'm looking at you. But overall, yeah, thanks for listening. Thanks for joining us today. Obviously, we as the designers here, and yeah, thanks a lot to the designers for joining us today. As they have mentioned, we do take your feedback very seriously. I take your feedback very seriously, and we understand that we always don't get it right, but we're always striving to make this game an enjoyable and deep narrative as much as we can. So yeah, that's all we have for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned a few things. I know I did. And yeah, hope we'll be back soon. Take care.